Good evening, this is John Milburn for Law's 11057 Introduction to Law. This is week 4 in term 3 of 2016. We have a number of people online. Tonight's significant because it's the night that we have to submit our first assessment piece. Many people already have. Thank you very much for that. Many have volunteered to assist their colleagues, and thank you even more for that. We have some questions, I think, in relation to it. And I should explain that I'm experiencing a thunderstorm here in Hervey Bay. So if I suddenly disappear off the screen, it's because of something that you might see in the background and the weather. Now, Dakota, I understand that you might have a question about the way in which the work is to be submitted.
Yes, I do. I just wanted to know if I've got my assignment created in the Google Docs, and I've hyperlinked everything and saved everything there. I just want to know if I copy and paste that onto a Word document with my name and then upload that through Moodle with the URL, if that's okay.
Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
John, it's Alan here. I have the same issue. I created a portfolio in Google Drive, Google Docs, and I think you may have had a look at it, but then I tried to copy and paste it into a Word doc to upload through Moodle, and it looked very poor. So the link is there to the portfolio, but the document that you're actually going to be looking at in Moodle is not the kind of document I'd like to submit.
No, I understand. Thank you, Alan. Thank you for the question, Dakota. Are there any other thoughts?
When I submitted mine, I just gave you the URL and a little bit of information, but I didn't actually put the entire portfolio in the Word document that I submitted. Just wondering, do you want me to do that, or if you can access it, is that okay?
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for those thoughts. I'll just weigh in here a bit, and if there are others, Melissa or Grace, if you want to add something, please do. The main concern for me is to ensure that you've done the work and that you've kept that work in the Google Docs directory. The idea of the Word document is really just a conduit, a way for me to get to your work. So, Alan, I hope I haven't created extra work for you in having to reproduce that work into a Word document. What I'm really interested in is getting to your source material which presents your work in the best way possible. So I'm really interested in a link, and I don't mind if in your Word document you just simply have a link to Google Drive so that I can access it. But you do need to ensure that I can access it, and that may mean giving some permissions. Before I come back to you, Dakota, Alan, is that consistent with what you've done, or is what I'm telling you now something that has effectively caused you a disadvantage?
No, John, not at all. It's consistent with what I've done. But just a little extra information. The portfolio that you create in Google Drive or Google Docs, whatever you want to call it, needs to be shared with you at cqulaw.net. If that doesn't happen, then the images and videos that are in the portfolio don't necessarily transfer through to you. And in addition, you've got to make sure that the videos or images that are stored that you want John to see are also being shared with him at the same address.
So saying that, sorry, Alan, could we just give John permission or access to our folder that has our portfolio in it? And then, John, would you just click onto the one that's called Portfolio, so you can have access to all of our videos and everything but will also be saved in there, just so you can have permission?
So if that's a way of getting me access to the material, that sounds fine. I think Alan did send me an email or two with a specific request, and a couple of people have done that, like a permission request. But other people, I think, are uploading their material through YouTube and making it public. So I think there are some different ways to do that. And again, my main aim is just to see your work at its best, but make sure I can get to it. And what I think some people are doing, they're testing it with others as well. Are there any other thoughts, Melissa?
John, if you do access our portfolio and then for some reason you haven't, the permission's not working for you, how will we know? Will you send us an email to say that you are unable to get into our hyperlinks? So
Absolutely.
we are aware.
If I can't access your material, I will send you an email or a message, and I'll invite you to do something that will allow me to have that access. If I can see that you've produced the work and you've uploaded on time, and it's simply an accessibility problem, then we'll get round that one way or the other. And one of the advantages of not committing to getting the work back to you by way of results until at least Sunday week is that it does give us that week to get things organised. This term's a little unusual in that next week, correct me if I'm wrong, is a holiday week. It's a break week. So you may have to work through the break a bit to help me to access that material. But I'm sure most people will still continue to read their emails. So thanks, Dakota. Melissa, is there anything you wish to add to that?
John, I just wanted to say that I found when I first opened my cqulaw.net account, the sharing permissions were set at default settings that anyone at CQU Law with the link can view. So there were a few different ways you could change it, that I could change it so that you could view it, you could edit it or whatever. But the default settings were anyone at cqu.law, however, whatever I just said, can view it. But I only changed my permissions that anyone with a link can view it because I sent the link to my daughter to test all my little clicky link things. But yeah, the default setting was, so I didn't put your name in every little box because the default was you should see it and all the links worked when I had them tested.
Great. All right. Well, that's a really good idea to have done that testing process first. Dakota, is that making you feel a little more comfortable? Oh, you want my email address?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Sorry, Dakota.
Yeah, just the right one. So I
my
can,
email address?
Yeah, your email address.
I think it's on Moodle. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's something like j.a.milburn@cqu.net.au. No, edu.
Edu. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I put the right one in.
I just type in J and your email address comes up underneath.
Yeah, there is.
Recognises you as my lecturers.
Thank you. Oh, here we are. Thank you, Lachlan. j.a.milburn@cqu.edu.au. Thank you very much for that. You'd think I'd know my own email address.
I have to jump in there.
Yes, Alan?
I think you've got to use the cqulaw.net address, John.
Okay.
People to access that drive.
Ah, right. And that's the point you were making before, Alan, that it needs to go to my cqulaw.net address. Right. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. That's an important. Is that what you were getting at, Dakota? Alan, can you...
yeah, I just wanted to make sure I had given the right email address access.
Of course, that is exactly the point that Alan made before. Alan, sorry to be a pest, but can you give us that email address? And I know I should know it, but if you can, that would be excellent.
Look, I think it's john.milburn@cqulaw.net, but I can't see it. I've got no way of seeing it at the moment.
If when you go into the sharing settings, you can add like specific people to the list. So I just added your email address that's listed there, just in case the other one doesn't work.
Thanks, Lachlan. So which email address did you add as part of the permission, Lachlan?
The one that's listed, the j.a.milburn@cqu.edu.au. But if you have anyone with the link within the law program can see it, you should be able to access it using the other email anyway.
All right. So in your view, either way will work. And I apologise that I just
put both in just to make
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Alan.
Just another comment, John. I think for all the features of a document, the portfolio to work, including videos, I think you've got to use the cqulaw.net address. I don't know why, but for some reason it seems to filter out the videos.
And once I start to review the material, certainly to answer your question, Dakota, I will contact you if I'm having technical difficulties this end, so you won't be penalised. And once I can make some better sense of things, then I will broadcast that. I do thank everyone who has contributed through UCrew in particular in providing information. That's been terrific. Please continue in that process. I'm very pleased to see that we've got some new people that have, new as in coming onto UCrew at the start, and people are starting to get the idea of it. So if you do have a question, please ask on UCrew, because I am amazed at the quality of answers that are given by colleagues in the course. As is painfully obvious, I'm not necessarily the best person to ask for an answer, and very often your colleagues are in a better position to provide an answer than I am, certainly in relation to these technical issues that we're working through. So thank you very much, everyone, for doing that. Right. Are there any further questions in relation to the first assessment?
There's no word limit on our key capabilities and evidence, is there?
No, there's not.
Yeah, okay, cool. Because I was really trying to put some evidence in there, and then I was like, oh, well, the other ones have how many words, but this one didn't. I just wanted to make sure before I submitted it. Okay.
Okay, good. And the idea of this course is something that you'll keep with you. So you don't need to put in too many words at the start. Shay Lowry kindly agreed to allow me to put her paper up on the screen as just to give people an idea that it can be done, and many of you have done that. So thank you to Shay, and thank you again for all those people that have been uploading their work. All right, I'll just see if there's any questions on the chat facility. No. We'll move on unless there are any further questions in relation to that assessment piece. I'm really keen to know if people have started to source law in particular places. It's not a prescribed text this year, but in a practical guide to legal research, a text that you probably should consider buying anyway, it talks about the difference between legislation and common law, talks about common law and equity. And we've touched on this briefly in the past, but can anyone tell me what we mean by legislation as opposed to common law? We'll start with that basic sort of question.
So are you just talking, John, about legislation being laws enacted by government and parliament, and common law being judge-made laws such as precedent?
Exactly. That's really my understanding of it. And that's what I think you should think about when we talk about that difference. Now, when it comes to legislation, can anyone tell me where it sits as opposed to judge-made law? What's more important?
Legislation has to be passed by a majority in the lower house, and then it goes to the upper house, and it also has to be passed by a majority. And if it gets knocked back by the upper house, it can go back through the lower house again and be put to the upper house once again. They might have to make amendments for it to be accepted the second time. And if it's not accepted the second time, the Governor-General, I think, can do like a revote of everyone in-house. Or not, something about, changing the people around because they can't come to a decision or something.
All right. Yep, so double dissolution.
I'm not too sure.
Double dissolution, I think you're talking about at the federal sphere. Okay, and when a law is passed, if it conflicts with the common law through the judge-made law, then the parliamentary law applies because there is the parliamentary sovereignty. Do we have an upper house in Queensland? I'm getting a few no's
Yes.
there. Yeah, right. So Grace says yes. Alan's shaking his head no. Anybody else wish to weigh in? Do we have an upper house in Queensland?
Alan was quite confident with his head shake, so I'm going to go with Alan.
Grace was pretty confident too, but what's another
I thought
word?
it was just the territories that didn't.
No. What's another word for the upper house that we typically hear? Lachlan says Senate. Anybody agree, disagree with that? All right, so the Senate.
No, yeah, I think so.
Okay, so in fact, Grace, we
Hard to
don't
remember.
actually have an upper house in Queensland. We don't have a Senate in Queensland. We're the only state that is in that way. So it is possible for legislation in Queensland to be passed potentially far more easily than is the case federally or in other states. All right, just another few questions to see if you've been doing your reading. What's an example of a law in tort, T-O-R-T? And this is really part of the Priestley 11 courses, the practice areas, page 25 of your text. What's an example of a tort?
Defamation.
Yes, I agree with that. Defamation is also part of our statutory law, and tort law we tend to think of historically as common law based, but defamation, I agree with that. So a tort, T-O-R-T, what does that mean? What do we mean by a tort? It's not a cake.
It's an issue of concern between individuals.
Yes, and it's the law where we look to remedy civil wrongs. So examples of tort law would be negligence, nuisance, things of that nature. And one of the leading cases you'll see is Donoghue and Stevenson in relation to the neighbourhood principle and foreseeability. So that's an example of tort law. Who's been using com law in order to access Commonwealth legislation? So that's no one?
I haven't actually gone to ComLaw to use it, but when I have done some Google searching and stuff, it has come up and I have linked through to it.
Okay. That's good. Okay. One of the hard things, of course, is that in a way, I'm asking you to do everything at once. And I appreciate that that's very difficult to do. But it is important that you try to get a feel for the law and read a bit broadly. And that's why I'm asking these broad questions. So just a reminder, com law, really would, if you haven't been into com law, I'd like you to do that in the next week. So that when I ask next time, who's been into com law and looked for a case, everyone will say, yes, I've done that. So with any luck, you can now see my second screen and a link to ComLaw, which is legislation.gov.au at a federal level. And you'll see, we've talked about this before, acts, gazettes, bills, etc. Okay, so that's ComLaw. What do we mean by the Office of the Parliamentary Council, Queensland? What's all that about? Anyone got any thoughts? And again, we're refreshing on what we did last week, so I want to make sure that we're doing our reading and retaining the information. What is the Office of the Parliamentary Council of Queensland? And what's its role?
I think one of their roles is to basically curate the legislation that that's produced by the Parliament.
Exactly. I like that answer. Thank you very much. And as we speak, I'm trying to access that website And of course, it's coming up very slowly. Probably something to do with the weather that's starting to come over the top. But that's exactly right, Alan. That's where we have our up-to-date authorised legislation in Queensland. All right. Has anyone else found any websites or places to access legal material that they'd like to promote as being worthwhile having a look at?
John, just this afternoon I was listening to the videos that are on the website at the moment, and it's extraordinary. It's really opened my mind to how much online resources there are out there for legislation, for cases, for the notes to legislation. It's just extraordinary and gives me I'd strongly recommend everybody spending some time having a look at those.
Thanks, Alan. I agree. There's some terrific resources out there. Again, when I started in the 70s, we had the law library, and that was it, no internet. But now it's just an amazing place to go and look for information. And a couple of weeks ago, I asked people to give some indication of their favourite law movies. We didn't have a lot of answers. We had some. But over the next week or so, I'd really like people to go on YouCrew and tell us about their discoveries in terms of what legal information they've found online and provide a link to it. So to get you started, it might be ComLaw, it might be the Office of the Parliamentary Council of Queensland, which is, wow, it took nearly 3 minutes for it to come up, but it's come up on my screen. Or it might be Ostley or Jade Barnett. Let's just have a quick look to digress at a thing that I have shown you, but it's the Office of the Parliamentary Council of Queensland. So I'm sure that next time we ask, we'll be right onto this. And so that's where we have the Queensland legislation, the repository of the Queensland legislation. And you'll see the top right-hand corner, under the search bar, it says Office of the Queensland Parliamentary Council. And Alan's right, it's really the office that curates the legislation, and not only legislation, but also bills, acts as passed, subordinate legislation with a link to the year. You've really got to just play around with these things in order to get a feel for where our law comes from. So I'm saying that parliamentary law is sovereign. It supersedes the case law. So the first thing is you've got to know where to find the parliamentary legislation. Excuse, my voice is going.
John, that's the site I usually go to for all my Queensland legislation, but I thought the site was called Legislation Queensland.
Right, and that's a tricky thing. Sometimes in law there are so many different names for what appears to be the same thing. And you have the authorised name, and then you have the name that we know it as, and they're quite different. So, no, that's good. So that's a really good place to go and look and get to know some material. Look, this week I've done a lot of travelling, down to Brisbane and back on Monday, Bundaberg and back every day this week. So a lot of travelling. And I've been doing basically 3 things. Number 1, listening to some CDs or the radio. That's as my break. Number 2, I have been listening to talkback. So when I say the radio, I mean just music. Second is I've been listening to talkback. And I was impressed with a talkback segment that I heard on the ABC. And the reason I'm saying this is I want you to think about something that is everyday, but now think about it from the perspective of being a lawyer or a law student. And as you know, I'm looking to promote this subject as if you're going to be practicing in law. Okay, so I heard an interview, and the interviewer was interviewing a young person who was suffering through issues to do with suicidal thoughts, self-harm, grew up through the child protection system, and relayed his story in a very compelling and emotional way. The person being interviewed was very articulate and spoke about his stories. He's now 22 years old and gave the history to it. That was interesting, But what I found very interesting, and what I really want you to focus on, is the way in which the interviewer took him through that story. It was brilliantly done, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the journalist who did the interview. But if you've got access to ABC recorded interviews, it might be worthwhile in this sense. What the interviewer did was take this person through by asking a series of open questions that enabled the person telling the story to give their narrative in the most effective way. And they did it beautifully in that sense, so that every time the person spoke, it gave the interviewer an opportunity to ask a question, which then led to the next part of the response. Now, the exercise for you is this. If you're listening to talkback interview, it'll be one of two types. What I've described is where someone is trying to bring out a positive story and they're using open questions to do it. In that type of scenario, as the interview is unfolding, I want you to listen to what is being said by the person interviewed, but then before the journalist comes in and asks the next question, think to yourself, what question would I ask? Okay? Now, it might sound like I'm teaching journalism class, but it struck me that the skill that the journalist was using is very much like the skill that's used in examination in chief. So when you're in court and you call a witness to give evidence, the process of the person telling their story is examination in chief. And your role as the lawyer is to come in at the right time, ask the right question, don't tell them the answer as a result of the question, but give it an open feel so that the person can continue the story and tell the story in the right way, in the right order. So does that make sense? In order to better understand that, I need to ask this question. Does everyone know what I mean by an open question? What is it?
An open question will leave the conversation with somewhere to go, like a closed question, just sort of, it's like you're answering the question and stopping the conversation from going. But an open-ended question, I'm just trying to think of an example, but to leave it open for someone to come back with an answer to your question.
Exactly. There's a little bit more to it. Anybody else got any thoughts? Yes.
A closed-ended question can be answered with yes or no, whereas an open-ended question is you get more description. So, yeah. So, do you like blue? What colours do you not like? Versus that, I think.
Things of that nature. Yep, exactly. So that's a really good way of thinking about it. Now, the second part of the exercise is this. Now, I'll have to whisper this because we don't want anybody else to hear this, especially people around you in your family, because I'm going to ask you to go through an exercise, and that is to speak to someone, a family member, a friend, a colleague in this class, and engage in an exercise where you're trying to draw out some information and a story, but in doing so, you're consciously asking open questions, and you're asking yourself as you go through that exercise, am I encouraging this person to tell the story in the right order, and am I getting them to tell it in the right way? Sometimes that means not bringing them back on topic. This is really hard exercise if you're talking to grandpa. This can be really difficult because grandpa wants to wander. But without telling the person what you're doing, try and engage them in a conversation, try and identify what the conversation's about, and then think to yourself, all right, I'm now involved in this process of examining the person by asking open-ended questions. And don't worry, it's not a bad exercise because people like being able to tell their story. And what you're trying to do is promote them to tell the story in the best way that they can so that they achieve the result of communicating this properly. So we do these exercises a little bit sometimes, but just give me some feedback on that. So that's the second thing that I want you to do over the break. And also think about the way in which good journalists draw out a story when you're listening to talkback radio. Look, there is the other type of interview that journalists have, and that's the cross-examination type interview, where they're examining a person not with a view to encourage them to tell this positive, uplifting story, but they're asking questions in order to destroy that person. All right, so the real, 6:30 current affairs type, chasing after them with the microphone type story. So you'll see in that instance, they're not open-ended questions, a lot of closed questions. So if you game, you can try that as well, but I'm not going to ask you to do that because people don't necessarily like that type of questioning. But just be aware of the difference between the two, and that's something that you'll come across during the course as well. All right, the next thing I want to ask is this. Does anyone know what a footnote is, and can anyone tell me how to footnote?
You gave a pretty nice demonstration of it. Oh, sorry.
You're right.
You gave a pretty nice demonstration of it, John, in one of the videos. A footnote can be just inserted from a Word document anywhere in the text, and it creates a footnote down below where you can insert other text.
It's in document, on a Mac, it's in document elements, and next to header and footer, there's a little section that says citations, and there's footnote or another one.
Good.
I use footnotes in history for Turabian style referencing, but you don't use it in Harvard style. So yeah.
That's right. And
comes up again in law.
I want the Australian Guide to Legal Citations type referencing rather than Harvard. So thank you, Alan, Grace. Dakota, did you want to say something?
Oh no, I was just agreeing with Grace with the Mac footnote where it is and stuff. Yeah.
Okay. So we're agreed it's pretty easy to do. So if you have troubles with it, please let us know. Now, legislation. What's the correct way to refer to legislation when you're typing it into some work? What's the protocol?
I know it's supposed to be in italics at the very first part, but so if you have the part, if you're referring to a provision, and it's say in a part and then there's a number and then there's a letter, do you do the part number and then the next number in brackets and then the letter in brackets? Is that right?
Yep, so the main point is that at the start, you're correct, it is in italics, and sometimes the legislation requires you to identify whether it's Commonwealth or state, but always there'll be the reference to the year as part of the legislation as well. But the main point that I was looking for is that you type it using italics in that legislation. So I'm not sure that I've got an example here on the screen, but the best way to do it, explain it, is when you're reading your textbook or you're reading a case, just take notice of those little things, because what we want to do is ensure that you identify yourself as a person who knows what they're talking about and knows which way to do it. So perhaps if I could leave it that way, Grace, rather than more specific, just ask you to look at that carefully when it comes to doing your reading. All right. Now, has anyone come across any ideas that they'd like to share about the way in which they undertake their research? Has anyone got any clues as to which is the best way to do things?
I don't know, like in my arts degree and in steps, if you're just like Googling something, you can just sort of use the important words, and you can type and or not. Like, so if you've got something that's specific, but you specifically don't want something that's involved with that, that's generally involved with that, but you don't want any information on that, you can type in the first specific and then not in capital letters and then the second specific. And you sort of, I think you do them in capitals usually, the and or not.
You do.
But I don't know if that's really used in law that much.
And yet we call those connectors. That's an important research skill to learn. And there are some really good commentaries that relate to that type of search. If you look through things like LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, CCH, you know, they're all good quality sources of commentary, and using those Boolean connectors. Those connectors is a very good way of basically doing your inquiries, your search. So when you're doing your reading...
Sorry, is this sort of what the toolkit will be about? I haven't looked at the video yet. Is it research skills? Or?
Yeah, there's some research skills in there. And also in your textbook, chapters 6 and 7 deal with legal research skills. So pay close attention to that. And what I'm mentioning now is really connected to one of the things we were talking about earlier, which is where are your favourite legal sites to go. So when you're doing your legal research, try and adopt a systematic approach. Try to, well, firstly, you've got to know where to start to look. And Google is not generally the starting place. It can be, but it's not generally the starting place for doing legal research. You need to learn a way to use the university online library. And I would recommend that when you do that, you supplement the research that you do through legislation, and we've looked at a couple of those sites tonight, with commentaries, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, CCH, and go between the two. There's an awful lot of material to read in law. It's not just a matter of reading the textbook. That might get you through the exam, but it certainly won't work for you in practice. You need to develop these legal research skills. I'm going to suggest to you that in many cases, you need to adopt something which is like a speed reading technique, where you have the ability to scan over considerable amounts of material and then identify the area where you need to slow down. And when you slow down, you may need to slow down very considerably when you get to the right spot and read it word for word. So that means trying to identify the broad area and then narrow down. When you're identifying the broad area of research, sometimes you need to identify a brainstorming mindset, which means that you have to consider a range of different potential ways of looking at the same legal research. And I agree with Grace in terms of using Boolean connectors. So if, for example, you wanted to research director's duties and the duty of a director, the duty of care of a director, then you might use connectors such that you have the words director's duties and then capital A-N-D, and in capitals, all caps, duty of care. So that's what we mean by using these connectors. And Grace was entirely correct in that those connectors could be or it could be and, or could be within, or whatever it might be, usually in capitals there. All right, let's see. Citing your research, I think we all should have looked at the Australian Guide to Legal Citations, and pinpoint referencing is something that I want you to learn about as well. Pinpoint referencing is where you identify a page or a paragraph in a particular case or something that you're referring to and identifying it. So what I don't want to see in an assignment is 20 footnotes, beautifully done, all saying the same thing, Australian consumer law. Well, that doesn't really help me because the Australian consumer law is huge. So if you're referring to the Australian consumer law, you're going to have to pinpoint the section that you're referring to that is relevant to the point you're making. If you're referring to a passage of law contained within a case, tell me the case, but pinpoint the page or perhaps the paragraph, depending on how it's set up. usually the page. So that's what I mean by pinpoint referencing. And you might see, and we'll wrap up soon, but you might see a thing called IBID. Has anyone seen that yet? IBID?
It's also used in Turbanian referencing, and it's if you are repeating the same source. Yeah. And I think you can make a note on the IBID as well if it's a different page or something. So in this case, maybe if it's a different section, but you're using the same act.
Exactly.
That might be wrong.
I agree with all of that. Just be careful not to overdo it. And remember, of course, it only applies to what is directly above. So if the sequence is broken, you know, you're referring to the Australian Consumer Law, IBID, and then you start talking about the Sale of Goods Act, and the next reference is back to the Australian Consumer Law, you've got to start again. You can't use IBID in those circumstances.
When you repeat it for the second time, even if there's been, just say the sales one, and then you went back to the Australian Consumer Law, do you have to do a full reference again, or is there a shortened version?
I would stick with the full reference again to be safe. Sometimes you can use shortened versions, but normally it's safe to go with the full version. All right, so in week 4, I'd also like you to consider chapter 7 of the text, which deals with interpretation skills and statutory interpretation. Some of you will be staying on with me for that in a little while. And just to answer a question, no, you don't need to footnote in your portfolio. Don't worry about that. That's fine. Thank you. Okay, you've been very patient tonight. Thank you very much. No tutorial next week. It's break week. That is correct. I hope. It's my understanding that we don't have a tutorial next week. If I'm wrong on that, I will make sure I broadcast it accordingly. Thank you very much again for everyone that has submitted their portfolio, and those of you that have helped, especially, thank you very much indeed. Okay, I'll stop the recording now. And thank you very much. Yes, Grace?
Just with the pinpointing the section, do you pinpoint this section and then the next number? I don't know what the next number would be called. And then also the letter that it falls under, or just the section, or the part? No, sorry, the part and then the section and then the letter that it's under.
Are you talking about pinpointing legislation?
Yeah.
If it's legislation, just you don't need to pinpoint the part or the division or the chapter of the legislation, just the section. So, for example, if this is what you mean, Grace, if you're referring to the Australian Consumer Law and you want to make a reference to Section 18, Section 18 might be contained within a certain chapter, part or division of the Act or the law. You just give me Section 18. You don't do the other bits as well. I hope that makes sense.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I'll read into it more. I remember reading about it last week. Thanks.
Okay, good. All right.
Thank
Any
you.
comments or questions from anyone? All right, thank you. I'll just stop the recording. All the best.